Welcome to the Ripple Effect. Today, we're tackling one of the biggest economic and political shifts of the new Trump administration, the recently announced tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. What started as a vague campaign trail threat has now materialized into policy, with the White House justifying these tariffs under national security and the fight against illegal immigration and fentanyl. Yet at a time when the US and Canada should be strengthening their partnership, these economic pressures, including the tariffs, risk driving a wedge between two of the closest allies in history. As geopolitical competition over the Arctic and critical minerals intensifies, maintaining a strong US-Canada partnership is not just a matter of economic policy, it's a national security imperative. At stake is not only the stability of the supply chains for defense technology, but also North America's ability to counter growing strategic competition from China and Russia. Are these tariffs an economic strategy, a political gambit, or a miscalculation that could weaken the very security they claim to protect? That's what we're unpacking today on the Ripple Effect. Nicholaus, this is going to be a good one. Over to you.
There's a couple things that are important to highlight here. The first being that, Americans and Canadians have been allies for a very long time and have a lot of the same shared security challenges and collective goals that they are trying to achieve. And so I think that, in the present plan of action, although it has been delayed, what's unfortunate is that if there is renewed tension between the two countries over a long period of time. Over these next 4 years, we're not going to achieve much in a period of time where we should be focusing very heavily on achieving some of these shared objectives. That being said, just taking inventory of some of this, Canada is one of the top producers of 17 of the roughly 50 U.S. designated critical minerals. And so you look at just that as a focal point here, and just highlighting one shared issue that we're both facing here. So the U.S. is short critical minerals, Canada's long critical minerals, and the U.S. is also short human capital with respect to metals and mining, human capital with respect to that entire industry. And Canada historically has housed that industry. That one of the biggest centers of capital markets for that industry is Toronto. Similarly, I mean, a lot of the ecosystem is based there. And while we need more intertwining on that matter, it seems like we're getting pushed further apart, and I don't know necessarily how that gets pulled back in the immediate term. I think a lot of Americans, one of the big things that, we are broadly insulated from is things that happen globally don't impact our economy or day to day to the same degree as things that happen in other countries. I always joke about this, like you can live in Texas and not read the news and nothing in your life will change. Whereas that's not the same in a lot of the places. And these tariffs, as I understand it, are quite damaging to the Canadian economy should they put into effect.
Very damaging. And I think, it also feels, and I'm a Canadian, as you know, but it also feels punitive, because if it's really about fentanyl coming into the United States, 99% of that fentanyl is coming in from Mexico, and a smaller percent obviously coming in from Canada. So why are the tariffs both 25 and 25? That piece of it just to me seems punitive, and really, like, who's punished overall through this process? If you're weakening the Canadian economy, what happens in terms of the critical minerals that the United States needs?
Well, and the other thing too that's quite interesting is if you have a look at just the basic principles of human interaction, if you put people under economic duress, they're much less likely to cooperate or be even marginally incentivized to cooperate under that particular set of circumstances. And that I mean, the way that I've understood this and reading news, speaking to people on the ground, is that this is, to your point, quite damaging economically if implemented as stated. And so I think that one thing that's got to really be discussed here is, what is the role of Canada in a fully fleshed out U.S. national security plan, ranging from critical minerals all the way to Arctic security. And I think just going back to that point on critical minerals, one thing that has been a huge issue in the U.S. more broadly is that we are just now starting to discover that this is a huge problem. Whereas Canada's had a functioning industry. There have been not without challenges, but a functioning industry for quite some time, and we really have not. And so, the degree to which we are reliant on the import of process knowledge across the board is quite significant. And if I'm looking at putting myself in the shoes of a Canadian leader, I would restrict that as a negotiating tool as this situation progresses, if heightened tensions are present. And so, I see that, and that will ultimately compound into other areas of interest that ultimately lead to inaction. And I think that it's kind of interesting because in a period of time where the rhetoric of the administration is so, hey, we've got to de-risk from China, we've got to get focused on being in a position to maintain defense capabilities and sustain defense capabilities and deterrence in the event of a real conflict, not a regional proxy war. You think Canada would be indispensable in achieving some of those goals, and that has not been part of any dialogue that I've seen today.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You think of what, the Pentagon's been saying for years is the US needs stable access to critical minerals for everything from fighter jets and missile systems. They need, lithium, nickel, cobalt, rare earths, all the things that Canada has. And right now, China dominates that global supply chain for materials. So, are these tariffs not undermining, a defense strategy?
The real ripple effect here is the inaction. I think that this comes through every part of the ecosystem here. As you'd think that and at the onset of we've had now just looking at the situation in Ukraine as an example of this. It appears that the proposed economic pressure and initial strategy by the Trump administration is going to be sharply rebuked by Moscow. And so that is going to be a prolonged issue. Trump has outright said that in exchange for future security guarantees, he wants the assurances slash marginal control over the rare earth resources in Ukraine. And so, you see this kind of like the negotiator as the chief executive is back. And you think that with respect to the situation in Canada, you look at, I mean, there's the Greenland, for example, which we discussed prior. There's 56,000 people in that country, and so like Canada has, as we mentioned, a critical minerals industry, but more importantly, existing infrastructure from which to discern a credible Arctic security plan, which is in our shared interest as well. And we've collaborated on this in the past, and so I think that similarly, in the wake of, because you got to think also, if you're part of the Canadian leadership, do you focus on security initiatives, or do you focus on the diversifying your domestic economy in the wake of distress? Because generally speaking, and we've seen this in some of the past interviews and discussion that we've done here, is that like if public finances get strained, the focus is on the economy, not defense. And you think that I mean we're clearly heading in that direction with the current rhetoric, wouldn't you say?
Well, I would, and I think really what it does is, it forces Canada, who, to point out, there's a little gap in leadership at the moment, but it's coming. But Canada has every incentive to start selling its critical minerals to Europe and Asia instead. And so, what does that mean for U.S. defense security?
Well, and to that same point, I think that and it comes at a time too where I was having this discussion with someone the other day. And I think it's relevant to point out is that like while there is a core shared value system between the Americans and Canadians, much more so than any other immediate neighbor, there are some areas where there is a divergence there, and I think that the set of rhetoric and circumstances is making that divergence a bit wider. And I know there's, I saw two columns, one in the Economist, one in the FT, talking about, what if Canada joined the EU, which I found kind of amusing. I mean, jurisdictionally, it's just kind of amusing that like that's in the elemental spectrum right now. But that being said, is that given the circumstances in play here, and I'm curious your thoughts on this. Do you think that Canada has more of a shared value system with Europeans or the Americans, given where the world is right now?
It's a wonderful question. I think, our immigration policies have been, very open. So we have a very diverse population with ties back to Europe. We were part of the Commonwealth. But yet at the same time, America is very much our closest neighbor, and given the scale and strength of the country, a bit of a big brother. So when it comes to national security, I think that we would definitely lean much more into the United States than Europe, and we've got a bit of a body of water between us. So it certainly makes more sense. And those are, they're interesting concepts to explore, but to actually unfold. Um, and at the same time, hearing Trump suggest that maybe, in addition to Greenland, we've got Canada as a 51st state. So, and that sends some ripples through the country for a whole host of reasons. But I think more broadly looking, if we come back to the Arctic, you have, Canada controls a big part of the Arctic, and maybe there's a better opportunity to bring the countries together around our shared role in Arctic security and, defense agreements.
Well, I think we're going to have to, because you have, and the 51st. I mean, that was, I mean, properly amusing, and I'm assuming most Canadians I presume would not be thrilled with that proposition. The coming.
It was proposed in the middle of winter. It gets a little cold up here, so I think some of us were thinking, well, you have Florida, Arizona, California. There's places to go that are warmer. So, but overall, yeah, Canadians are a proud people. So I don't think it landed quite well. It probably landed exactly where it was meant to.
And it's funny when you think about how this really will play out, and one thing that is a critical issue here is that the and part of this goes back to the public finance discussion, is that if there is going to be a proper Arctic security focus here, Russia has been aided by China, who's got one of the world's largest shipbuilding industries now, and building icebreakers and building infrastructure in the Arctic from which to the take advantage of becoming increasingly navigable waterways with
Yeah.
the and so, the U.S. has been behind on this for a long time. And Canada, to a same degree, with what's presumably strained public finances, like almost every country in the West right now, post the financial crisis and now COVID, is going to be reliant on the cooperative activity to bolster that security. And so I think that people don't realize how quickly these issues will show up on. This is the first time. It's really interesting. So you look at Europe, right? When the situation in Ukraine kind of broke out, and you go to the UK, you go to France, you go to Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, and you talk about, hey, what do you think about this? Like in a lot of cases, the Second World War was quite some time ago. The concern is this will show up on our doorstep if we're not careful,
Yeah.
right? And that's never been the case for the U.S. or Canada. But this is that same rhetoric is applicable to the situation in the Arctic if action is not taken. And it's unfortunate because this next for it, you can't, like, this icebreakers, for example, you can't just start building these things overnight. Like, it takes
Oh.
planning, infrastructure.
Or the critical minerals infrastructure. It just doesn't happen overnight.
th-
It
th- this is a multi-year focus,
Yeah.
and and we have an issue here where these, assuming that you look at some of these timelines, right? And they're saying, well, we need to be prepared to deter Russia by 2032, deter China by 2028, in some of these matters. Like, and this, if this doesn't start right, that's that we're 7 years away at the peak, right? It takes 10 years to get a mine fully sorted.
Yeah.
5 years to get it in a full icebreaker program rolled out. Like, some of this is hugely challenging. And I think the real takeaway here is that hopefully we can have our populations here get to a shared focus on collective defense and national security focus around these issues, versus working towards a situation where we have increasing value system divergence and a set of prohibitive economic policies that really don't act in the best interest of either country. Like achieving fairness is different than deterring collective objectives, and I hope that we're able to revisit some of this and get to that point where every trading relationship, you could argue, has some the characteristics of unfairness, but the main thing I think is that level setting something in collective interest of allies is really where we have to go, and I'm hoping that gets done in the coming weeks. Otherwise, the ripple effect here is going to be inaction that will ultimately embolden some of these adversarial characters that are increasingly focused on expanding their influence in areas like the Arctic and in areas such as the access of hypercritical minerals and materials for defense and related industries.
Yeah, I think you're bang on. And I think, if this is really about national security, we're seeing a policy contradiction.
To be continued. We shall see where this takes us.
To be continued. Thanks very much, Nicholas.